First of all, just to help you with note taking in case you wanted to take notes, see where I'm highlighting down here in the lower right? If you just make note of that URL, you can type that into any browser and all the materials that I'm presenting today will come up available for download. So if you just make a note of that URL, you could either write it down or take a picture of it and type it in later. But I want to take just a few minutes, not the bulk of the time, but just enough to introduce you to the problem, which is that our high-tech infrastructure is extremely vulnerable. My background in software engineering tells me that cell phones are weak and not very robust in any kind of disruption. And I can explain some of the reasons why. And nowadays everybody's on a cell phone. So if we lose our cell phones, we're pretty much in the dark and can't talk to anybody. And that's leading to the solution, which is ham radio for when cell phones fail, basically. And I've got a little call to action and Q&A, but you can ask questions. Feel free to ask questions as we go. So jumping right in on the problem. There is a book that came out a few years ago by kind of a well-known broadcaster, Ted Koppel. He did a really good job describing what's going on with the possibility for cyber attack, which would bring down our whole infrastructure, internet. If the internet goes, cell phones go, because they're one and the same. Cell phone communication is voice over IP, which is basically internet. Okay, the link to that video is in the chat window. It's just like 3 minutes if you can play it on your own. But also with EMP, I'm sure you're familiar with that. You basically have a former Speaker of the House and former CIA director working together on a committee to say that in the event of an EMP, which would take out our big transformers, we could be down for 6 months, 18 months. And in the document that I've linked up here, they tell you right out that up to 90% of the population could perish as the result of a countrywide EMP. That's a pretty shocking statistic. And you can imagine over the weeks leading into that, the chaos, the social disruption. Of course, cell phones wouldn't be working. I've got a link to a YouTube video here that shows what happens to a Ford Taurus when it goes through an EMP field. It just stops dead. You can look at that later. Have you heard the Carrington event? This is about solar flare. 1850 something, a solar flare hit the United States. They measured, they're able to go back and measure things because it took out the telegraphs, even though that was a fairly robust technology at the time. And they have some idea how big that was. There's a very similar solar flare that just missed us in 2012. It turns out the Earth was slightly offset from the sun. We heard all that hype in 2012 about solar flares and end of the world, where we almost got it in 2012. The article's linked up there. Both of those are really good to look at, I think, if you're thinking about solar flare. But essentially, high magnitude solar flare of the class of the Carrington event and the one in 2012, if it had been a direct hit, would have taken out the entire grid in the United States, possibly for a very long time, because it could have burned up some of our big transformers. So let's get right into the solution. I've done a little visual comparison left and right here. You see the $1,000 plus iPhone with the monthly fee. Then you got the $55 ham radio pictured on the right. It turns out the ham radio is just much more robust and useful for any of the solutions and any of the scenarios described on the previous slide. A lot of potential for some really long-term outages. No dependency on voice over IP or internet infrastructure. It's all just radio to radio. Also, the added advantage of one-to-many communication. And then with your little handy talkie here, you can plug into repeaters and I'm going to talk more about that. I've got one here on the ranch, and there are probably 100 across Utah to really extend your range.
It's
Okay, more about repeaters. I think I'll leave it in this mode so I can see what I'm doing. So yeah, take a look at all these red dots on the map here in Utah. People who have ham radio capability, just with the little handy talkie, the little $55 handy talkie that I showed in the previous slide, can plug into all of these repeaters across the state of Utah and really extend their range across thousands of square miles. I'm talking the repeater on my ranch is good for 10,000 square miles. Interlinking to some of these other repeaters, you go 100,000 square miles or more. And so if, like Helen, like you were saying, if you've got a community in Logan, if you've got people in Salt Lake City, Delta, Sanpete County, all across Utah and even beyond, if they, from a people restored perspective, wanted to be in touch with each other to pass information between their communities, well, we would just plug into this existing repeater infrastructure and talk across the valleys and find out what's going on and see what we could do to help.
Can I ask a question?
Yeah, go ahead.
With the EMP stuff, how does that not affect the ham radio frequencies? Because it seems like it's all electronic.
So the ham radio frequencies are just there. The EMP isn't going to affect those. It's the equipment that uses those frequencies. And most of the ham radio operators that I talk to every day are really aware of that. I, for example, have EMP protection on my equipment. I have spare equipment locked up in Faraday cages. And the repeaters that you see on that map, most of them are in metal enclosures that to a large degree would function as a Faraday cage. And most of them are an emergency power capability. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, it does.
Okay.
Ellen, if there was like a direct overhead EMP over Utah, pretty much everything, even with EMP protection, will be fried. It's not banking on that.
Yeah.
It's not banking on that. It's banking on a large global type of event where you're dealing with the aftermath and the after effects. There are some things that people can do. I have to do all this stuff for my solar because we have to do EMP shielding. But if there was like a directly over Salt Lake City, and we're talking relatively close proximity, then we'd pretty much anybody that doesn't have something disconnected and buried somewhere effectively is going to be rebuilding infrastructure. But his point is like a solar flare wouldn't necessarily produce something that wipes out all electronics, but it could wipe out anything powerful enough that it's more fragile to this type of impact. And the reason that he says that you're 6 to 18 months out for a grid shutdown is that, just to give you an example, is those little transformers, those capsules you see up on poles, like they're shaped like a capsule. Have you seen those before, Helen? For power poles, for example.
Power drops,
yeah. So if 2 of those went down across the Wasatch Front, we would have no spares after that because we only have 2 spares in our infrastructure. So and the manufacturing for those is done overseas. And so basically, if you had, like, our infrastructure is incredibly fragile. And so the advantage of ham radio is 2 things. Is one, you can do things that are protect it to some extent. And it's decentralized, meaning that anybody with a radio anywhere, that the radio itself is tapping into the frequencies. And so it doesn't require towers to function necessarily. And so it's decentralized. And then the other thing is that they can run on relatively low amounts of power compared to what's required in order to maintain things like the cellular system or the internet system and that type of thing.
Okay.
Very true. Yeah.
Although Starlink is doing a lot to make that the internet element less of an issue. But yeah, so I'm on board with everything he's saying. We've looked into a lot of this stuff. It's really cool. And I mean, if there was a really, really cataclysmic event, then yeah, we're going to be starting over, but it's better than than what currently sits. So that's how fragile it is right now, just to give you an idea.
Super fragile. And even if a lot of these repeaters went out in some severe EMP, you've still got all the ham radio operators with their local
That's right.
equipment, which
That's
many
right.
of them keep protected and have spares buried in double and Faraday cages and such. I know I do. So, yeah.
Yeah. So the point is this: it's radio is decentralized communication, so you're not reliant on one centralized network. And the other advantage of that is that currently it's really, really difficult. The regulations are really old in radio, and so it's currently pretty difficult for your own governmental system to add additional regulations to the use of radio.
Mhm.
So there's all sorts of it provides a pretty substantial backup to pretty much every major concern, every communications concern you could have.
Good points.
Jane here with a question.
Yeah.
Okay, so, but to power your radio up, you do need to have batteries and power them up. What's your take on that?
Well, a lot of people, the ham radio people tend to be preppers, and they tend to have generators and backup power supplies and all kinds of capability to replenish and charge.
For example, we're gonna be doing one out in our community, and we all run off the solar.
Mhm.
So for us, the grid going down is no problem.
Yeah. So I've got a repeater on our ranch. It's a standalone repeater. This is before I moved it to the location on the ridge, Jane, but this is what a repeater looks like up in the upper right. You see it's tied into a bunch of infrastructure in the lower left of the picture down here. That's what you call a duplexer, which allows the input and output frequencies to operate on the same antenna. And that's about a $5,000 piece of material there between all the setup and the enclosure. But for the notes, in case you're ever coming through Sanpete County and want to use the repeater, if you are a ham radio operator, there's the frequency offset and the activation tone. Coverage is just on this little standalone repeater. It's pretty amazing. All of Sanpete County, Salina to well past the Utah County line on the north, down into Juab County, Salt Creek Canyon through into Nephi, many areas of Utah County. So really, realistically, it's got about 10,000 square miles of coverage, which I think is amazing. And Jane and I have tested the capability across the valley. I can be in some pretty weird places like the parking lot of Costco at Spanish Fork and talk to Jane on Spring City. I don't know how it propagates, but it does.
That's awesome. That's very impressive.
Yeah. And that's just radio to radio. That's no interlinking or dependencies of any kind with any other equipment. So your capabilities as a ham radio operator can expand dramatically if you go beyond the little handy talkie and invest a little bit more into some extra equipment, $100 antenna outside, maybe a base station or a mobile unit for your car. That's about 500. Another 100 for this antenna. I have set up an embedded Word document here that's sort of a shopping list. You can double click that in the PowerPoint when you access it. And I've got some recommended entry level equipment and other more advanced equipment. And you can follow those links out and get some prices. But even with the advanced options, I totaled it all up. It's under $1,000. People drop $1,000 for a new iPhone without even thinking. And yet, they wonder how they can afford some ham radio equipment. So I think we just need to change our programming in our minds and think a little more realistically. But I put together a shopping list with lots of nice options too, like programming cables and battery eliminators and adapters and all the kinds of things accessories that you would like to have with your equipment. And it's here as a reference in case you want to follow those links and get into it. So what happens in an emergency? Well, we, as ham radio operators, we activate our local nets. And Jane has a Spring City net. I have a San Pete community net. We'd be talking to each other because we crosstalk across those different nets. Jane's is actually on a radio service called GMRS. I'm on ham. Jane has a lot of block captains and people here in the city and everything divided up. Those people would be working on the street, checking the people's welfare and gathering information. They could pass it up to the ham nets. We could go statewide with that, other cities nearby. And we also have in the nets that we participate in, we have ham radio operators that are communicating on global nets, talking to South America and all the way into the other side of India and everywhere, worldwide communications. If we had a communication blackout and people are wondering what in the heck is going on, we could get traffic from those global nets, put it into our 2-meter and 70-centimeter nets, pass it down to the cities, the churches, and it would just be super essential, I think, and important for people to know what's going on rather than operating in the dark and wondering what's going on in the world. And this would be the way to do it. Passing emergency traffic up and down the chain basically is what we do. How to get a ham radio license. Here's your call to action. Here's what your piece of paper looks like when you get it. This is mine. I am KC7LXX. And on this slide, I've provided resources on what you would do to get a ham radio license. You can get your equipment before you get your license, or you can do it the other way around. It doesn't matter, but you get free practice tests. There's a 35-question test you have to pass. People as young as 7 years old pass these tests, so it's no big deal. You just study a little bit and go for it. There's a pool of 400 questions. If you want, you can just go through all 400 questions and memorize the answers and go take the test. Whatever your learning method is, but the answers are provided. Then you can take a remote exam if you want, or you can come in person, take the exam. And then there's all these online full courses. If you want to actually go through somebody presenting the material over a period of hours, you can watch these pre-recorded lessons. But however you study for the test is up to you. That you want to either get a remote exam or come in person, and then you'll have your license issued and you can get some equipment. And people like myself can jump in to train you from a practical perspective about what's going on and how to operate and what the protocols are, because you don't learn that from the test. But we're here to help. We got an entire community of ham radio operators, hundreds within my circle, and people are willing to partner up and help as needed. So if you're interested in this path, jump right in and go for it. And then the end result of that is that if we have these people restored communities across different valleys and different cities, even if you have 2 or 3 in each place that are working together in kind of a regional sub-team, I would call it, to get to know each other and to learn how to communicate across the mountains. I think that would be really good to do that in advance and get that sub-community running across all of the communities so that in an emergency, the different little subgroups could be talking to each other.
This is great. So is there like a cost to the test? Do you know how much the test is to take?
Yeah, the test is, there's a $15 fee for the volunteers who come together to do the test. You usually pay that with a cash or check. And then the government has a $35 activation fee that you pay with credit card when you are filling out the paperwork to get your license.
Okay. And is there a reason why they have like a license for ham radios? Like what's the
Yes,
behind
there's
that?
tons of reasons.
Mhm.
It's so that the system doesn't get abused. It's there's ways to cause problems on radio frequencies. There's all sorts of ways to cause problems and create interference and all that stuff.
Good point. Yeah, to think about the CB traffic. You know, CB is just another piece of the bandwidth that was like 10 meters is the
Yep.
wavelength. It became just trash talk and junk and people being rude and interfering and playing music and swearing all the time. And it's because it was an open deal. It didn't require any skin to get in the game. And then there was no community to monitor it. So that we don't
Yeah, so
want
like-
ham radio to turn into CB.
Yeah, so like Helen, a really easy example of this is there are emergency frequencies that the government uses that you're not allowed to operate on. Like you can actually listen in on frequencies, but there's frequencies you're not allowed to engage in. And some of the equipment he's showing, like you couldn't do that on like a handheld radio because they're built a certain way. But if you had a better piece of equipment, you could jump on any frequency you want. Like you can get onto anything, you can interfere with it. So there's emergency frequencies. Technically, the television is operating on radio frequencies, so you can get in on even though they're doing away with those. You can interfere even with cell signals with radio frequencies. So there's a lot of like decorum in the ham radio community because right now the ham radio community is pretty self-regulating. Correct me if I'm wrong, if I'm stepping outside of bounds, but the ham radio community has their decorum, and because they're good at self-regulating, meaning that they go after their poor performers. Like if there's somebody abusing it, the ham radio community usually goes after them. That the government has largely stayed out of high interference with it.
That's true.
Am I incorrect in that?
Oh, it's a self-policing community. It absolutely
Yeah.
is. A lot of good people
Yeah.
who care about keeping it good and strong.
Okay, awesome. Well, thank you so much. This has been
Yeah.
so,
Yeah, it's been nice meeting you all and chatting. You've got a good thing going here, and we're happy to jump in and share our skills where we have them.
I think that's awesome. Thank you. And that's what's going to make this all work. So thank you. Okay, well, I guess
Okay.
that's it for today. And we'll be talking with you guys soon. So thank you so
Okay.
much.